Karen Lynn Davidson has 2 degrees from BYU, her bachelor's and master's, and she got a PhD from USC, and I'm sure you remember the LA Coliseum down there, right across the street basically. I started selling programs there when I was 8 years old, and it was even a dangerous neighborhood back then. It probably hasn't gotten any better, but USC is a fine university, and so that's where she got her doctorate. She taught at BYU for a number of years, where she was a member of the English faculty and director of the honors program. She, of course, is known to you as being the author of Our Latter-day Hymns, and this is the new revised edition, which bears quite a bit of revision and enlargement. Unfortunately, they just published it in paperback, which is kind of a no-no for us, but we'll take it. It was preceded, of course, by the hardback edition. We have some of each. The book that she's going to be primarily talking about tonight is Eliza, the Life and Faith of Eliza R. Snow. And she'll tell you a little bit about another volume coming, but I won't say much other than it was published by Deseret Book, as the same publisher that did the hymn book. This volume, which is the complete poetry of Eliza R. Snow, which Karen and Jill also edited, is now out of print. I mean, it's a substantial volume. Waited a number of years for someone to take this on, and it's a great addition to the growing body of books on Eliza R. Snow. She was also involved in the 2 histories volumes in the Joseph Smith papers, along with a number of other editors. And so that's her growing, what's the word, oeuvre? If any of you know what that word is, you get an extra Tootsie Roll when you checking out there. Karen also, her book, the complete poetry one, received the prize for Best Documentary Book from the Mormon History Association. Is that correct? Did I get that right? And she's also been a volunteer in the Church History Department. And that's pretty much. I will just say that usually when I'm introducing an author here, I know that author and have been friends for a number of years. It's been a pleasant experience for me to meet her for the first time tonight. And she's a delightful person and an accomplished historian and researcher and author. And we're very excited to have with us tonight Karen Lynn Davidson. Did you just want to Let's see how that works. And get your stuff.
That's fine. It's very nice to be here this evening, and I'm grateful to Benchmark Books. They have a fan base. Eliza has a fan base. I give credit to both of them. My co-author would love to be here, but she also loves being where she is, and she and her husband are having a wonderful time as church history missionaries in charge of 15 European countries. So that's an assignment made for them, and they were made for that assignment, and it's really very wonderful. One of the earlier Eliza R. Snow scholars is a name that some of you will know, Maureen Ursenbach Beecher. She compiled the personal writings of Eliza Roxy Snow. Then, when this was finished, she bequeathed her file drawers to Jill Derr, my co-author. And Jill undertook work on Eliza R. Snow very seriously. The forthcoming book is a full-length definitive biography of Eliza R. Snow, which is Jill's major project that she is working on now. And she decided, before the big biography, she would tackle another project, and that was a documentary edition of all the poems of Eliza R. Snow. That's this one, The Brick of a Book, 1,300 pages long. She wrote 507 poems, and some of them are quite long. And she invited me to work with her as a co-editor because she knew that I had spent most of my academic life being a disc jockey for poems. And it may be true to say that huge body of poetry is important mostly for what you learn about history from it, but after all, they are poems. Somebody needed to treat her as a poet, and so we did, and that's a project that'll never have to be done again. It serves a good scholarly purpose. It's more poems and more information than most people want. So, in the meantime, while the biography, the big one, is still forthcoming, Jill and I decided to put together something a little more inviting. We asked Deseret Book to do pretty, and they did pretty. They really did a wonderful job. It's a very inviting book, and so this one is a biography. It's only 7 chapters long with a lot of visual interest, and we're hoping that people will say, oh, this doesn't look so forbidding. I can do 7 chapters. I can learn some more about Eliza R. Snow. We had to do it through email because the work had to go on while she was in Germany, and so Deseret Book and Jill and I did a whole lot of emailing, but we were pleased that this book came out, and this is, we hope, an appealing biography. It is also a documentable, is that a good word? Biography, where everything that we talk about can be backed up, and we use pictures of her needlework, we use quotes from her poetry, and a lot of photographs and other things. Well, I won't talk for too long. I'll talk for maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes, then you're free to ask questions. I know that some people come to an event like this and you're on your way to someplace else, and that's just fine, so everyone should feel free not to stay for questions and answers, but I'm glad to answer questions or answer them individually after 15 minutes, 20 at the most. Everyone knows the name Eliza R. Snow. She's always had a fan base. In the last decades of her life, here in Salt Lake, every member of the church knew her name, just as today it would have to be a very new convert not to have heard of Eliza R. Snow. People know who she is. They know a few things about her, and they're usually the same things. What do people know about Eliza R. Snow? What comes to mind first when people think of her? Oh, my Father, Mother in Heaven.
Married to Joseph and Brigham.
Married to both Joseph and Brigham. Not everyone knows that, but most people, I think, do. Married to both Joseph and Brigham. Oh, My Father is a hymn text that serves as a virtual scripture, has since it was written. It was an immediate success. People have loved that poem since it was written. Most women, at least, know the story of the First Relief Society and that she helped draw up the original proposal. You know, she lived to be 83 years old. She did a lot more than those things. And so in our book, we try to cover some of those things that people don't know as well about Eliza R. Snow. Let me just mention what 3 or 4 of them are, just very briefly. Some of you have heard me tell about this, but one thing that was not an achievement particularly, but it's an experience that we have quite a few details about, not thanks to her, thanks to the suitor that she gave the brush off to when she was 25 years old. The reason this becomes so interesting is that she says in her brief autobiography, although in my youth I had considered marriage ordained of God, and without vanity can say, I had what was considered flattering proposals, I remained single. And why? I could not comprehend at the time. But after embracing the fullness of the gospel, I feel to acknowledge the kind, overruling hand of God in that circumstance. I do not know that one of my former suitors have received the gospel, which shows that I was singularly preserved from the bondage of a marriage tie, which would in all probability have prevented my receiving or my free exercise of the religion which is now dearer to me than my life. Later, she was writing this in the 1870s and 1880s. Much later, decades after this happened, this is her little summary paragraph. She tells us no more. She says proposals, plural, suitors, plural. We don't know about any of them except that one of the men spilled the beans. And he spilled the beans about 50 years later when he was writing his memoirs. And he tells the whole story of how he, as a single man of her same age, 25, moved into town and became the poetry editor of the local newspaper. Got to know who she was, put on a ruffled shirt to impress Eliza's father when Eliza's father came to check him out. Wrote her a love poem and published it in the newspaper, which was going too far as Eliza was concerned. And she wrote a poem back to him telling him to get lost. And he tells it with great good humor. He's now a man in his 70s, and he's just saying, you know, I was young, I was smitten, she wouldn't have anything to do with me, and that's that. He kept all these poems, he remembered all these details, and the reason he tells about it in such detail in his memoirs is that he's working up to a punchline. When she wrote her poem, brushing him off, one of the lines is, "Who would a friend in fractions be?" In other words, he was flirting with all the girls. Who would a friend in fractions be? So he says, I have kept track of Miss Snow. She joined the Mormons and traveled west with them to the Salt Lake Valley, where she is now the fractional wife of Brigham Young. And that was getting his little dig in. But people don't know this, and it's delightful to know it, especially as she's reflecting. None of these boyfriends, it never worked out. And she sees the Lord's timetable, his hand in her life. And the really wonderful thing about this is, why was he writing his memoirs? He was famous. Look him up any place you want. Online, Dictionary of American Biography. His name was James Barr Walker. A lot of his theological works are still in print. I ordered one because it was called The Philosophy of the Plan of Salvation, if you can imagine. He was a very well-known Protestant theologian, an anti-abolitionist. He and his wife started an orphanage. They would have made a great couple, except that, as she says, she could not have carried out her life's mission of strengthening the saints, shall we say. That's something people don't know, and it's very fun to read about. Another thing that really nobody knows about, I'll just mention it because I've been thinking about it so much lately. What would it have been like for Eliza in 1844 when Brigham Young, with some kind of harsh words, called a halt to Relief Society? And after the death of the prophet, the Relief Society was canceled. Emma Smith and others had been using the Relief Society organization to speak against plural marriage, and you can understand her resentment, but you can also understand Brigham Young knowing he could not lead a church with this kind of division going on. And so he, Brigham Young, didn't say this to the sisters, but he's quoted as having said this to a meeting of the brethren in 1845. When I want the sisters or the wives of members of the church to get up Relief Society, I will summon them to my aid, but until that time, let them stay at home. Wow. This had meant so much to Eliza. And here, 2 and 3 years later, this was gone. Now think of Eliza being married to Brigham Young all this time declining to Resurrect Relief Society. What was going on? We can only extrapolate. Maybe she was reminding him periodically that it might be a good idea to reinstitute the Relief Society, or maybe she said nothing. She knew how to be patient, and maybe she knew it would have to originate with Brigham Young when the Relief Society came back again. She got her wish, in any case, about 1864, 1865, when the coming of the railroad was no secret. Everyone knew that the railroad was coming to Salt Lake, and that the Gentiles that they had worked so hard to separate themselves from were now coming to them. Everybody needed to mobilize. The men, the women, the young people, everybody needed to get ready for this. And so by 1867, Brigham Young was saying, "Now, bishops, you have smart women for wives, most of you. Let them organize female relief societies in the various wards." And so on a ward level, we have many talented women among us. Well, thank you. Finally, he's admitting that. And what it must have meant to her, it was really not until later that she was called as general president of the Relief Society. That was after Brigham Young's death. But finally, the Relief Society was back again. Women had organized informally, sometimes under the name of a ward relief society, to do good works. But finally it was coming back again. And Eliza did a brilliant thing. There were probably many women who were wondering why this had happened and how this had happened, but she told a group of sisters in 1868, "It is no ordinary thing to meet in an organization of this nature. This organization belongs to the organization of the Church of Christ in all dispensations when it is in perfection." So in other words, what did a gap of a few decades mean? What difference does that make? It was similar, we might say, to temple work, not restored all at one time, and interrupted if circumstances required that it be interrupted. That doesn't matter if it was part of the ancient order of things, and that's what she taught. And I think that is just a wonderful, wonderful approach and a wonderful way of taking some of the sting out of this. A lot of people don't know about the great exertions of the last decades of her life. Now, the Snow family has really good genes for longevity. Lorenzo didn't become president of the church till he was 84 years old. Eliza not only lived to be 83, she kept her vigor and her strength. And when she was 68, she got to do something that really must have seemed miraculous to her. She went on a 9-month tour of Europe and the Holy Land. Just 9 months at sea and on camelback and everything else by stagecoach. That sounds a little draining, but she loved it. And Orson Whitney said she came back invigorated in mind and body. She went as part of a Mormon delegation to rededicate the land of Palestine for the gospel, and wrote poems back to the Women's Exponent to be published as a thank you gift to the sisters of the church because they had donated money to send her on this trip. When she got back, instead of resting on her laurels as the famous Eliza R. Snow, she went on a trip to southern Utah that lasted about 6 months, and used that opportunity because now that the relief societies were starting to look like they were pretty well organized, she would visit relief societies, but also, what about the children? What about the children of the church? So she and Aurelio Rogers and Emmeline B. Wells or really Roger usually gets top billing, but they all worked, to organize the primary, and she traveled throughout southern Utah, having the children in primary meetings hold Joseph Smith's watch in their hand. He had given her a beautiful watch. Pass it from one to the other, and she would say, "Now, children, never forget that you held in your hand a watch that belonged to the prophet Joseph Smith." And Zina Huntington, who had been a wife of Joseph Smith and a wife of Brigham Young, went with her on this trip, and she and Zina would stand in front of the children's group holding hands and say, "Children, if anyone should ever try to tell you that Joseph Smith had but one wife, you remember, you saw two of them together at the same time." And just traveling all the time, traveling constantly, and meeting with the sisters and also meeting with the children all over southern Utah. We kind of forget her contribution to children. She, in the last years of her life, I guess figured that, well, her interest in Relief Society continued, but she figured that she would turn her attention to children. She edited and compiled 5 books of primary music, primary recitations. She wrote poems for children to be published in the Juvenile Instructor. She had had 2 stints as a school teacher in Kirtland, and she also taught school in Nauvoo. Not everybody is cut out for school teaching, and we kind of read between the lines, and I don't think she saw herself as making a career in front of a classroom. But this longing to help young people, to help them understand. She could be too preachy sometimes. She wrote a poem. You know, children don't like this. They don't like to be lectured to or told what they should be doing. To Ernest, we don't know who poor little Ernest is. "Be very careful of your books, to neither tear nor soil them, but keep them looking clean and neat, and not neglect or spoil them." And it goes on, this poem telling Ernest how he should behave. And some of her poems to children are just too harsh. They're too preachy, but she knew also how to hit just the right note sometimes. The Juvenile Instructor editor asked if she would write something for young people telling about the struggles of Nauvoo, telling about the hardships of Nauvoo. That doesn't go over children really if you sit them down and say, "You have it so easy, you don't realize how hard it was for us." And she knew that was not what to do. So she wrote a story called Our Dog Jack. Now, any young person is going to wonder, what about Our Dog Jack? And Our Dog Jack was a wonderful watchdog that they owned in Missouri, and the neighbors didn't like him because the neighbors couldn't creep up to the house and rob things or do whatever they wanted. And so she tells all about this wonderful dog and how when her brother Lorenzo had been ill, this dog would go out hunting with Lorenzo and knew how to hold still so that Lorenzo could rest his gun on the top of the dog and not have the gun shaking in his hands. And these little details just showing how much they loved this dog. The neighbors shot the dog, and they held a funeral for the dog. So that's sad. It's also very memorable. It also does the job, more than any general statement about Missouri ever could, of describing how awful that was, what enemies some of their neighbors were. So she had good instincts in a lot of things. She could also, for children and for adults, be quite demanding. She expected a lot of people. To her, with her strong belief in Joseph Smith, in Brigham Young, in the scriptures, combined with her poetic imagination, the heavens were just open. She could see all these things. She could see heavenly rewards. She could see how great the future was going to be, and she just had a hard time understanding sometimes why other people couldn't get on board. She has 2 lines in a poem of hers called The Ship. It's about the gospel ship, and the 2 lines are, "There's no cabin passage on Zion's trip, on Zion's ship, it was never designed as a pleasure trip. And she just couldn't understand people who expected it to be a pleasure trip. She had been through so much, and she wanted everybody to kind of come along with her. Well, so there are a lot of things, a long, very active life when she was turning her talents to administration, speaking, writing, and the early history of the church is impossible to conceive of without her help. She was right there at the right hand of Brigham Young, and yes, it did turn out that he needed the women of the church, and he needed her, and she was ready, and she was prepared. So I think we owe her a lot. It was my sister-in-law who said just the other day, when I think of Eliza R. Snow, I think that she lived to strengthen the saints, and I have really thought a lot about that description of her, and there is so much truth in that. Well, let's just take questions if anyone has questions, or we can call a formal end, and people can ask questions who would like to, and it's just been very nice to talk to you all. Yes.
I'd like to know marriage dates of Joseph Smith and also Brigham Young.
She was married and sealed to Joseph Smith on the 29th of June, 1842. She was married 4 times to Brigham Young, not very long after that, 3rd of October, 1844.
And my other question, did she have children of her own?
No, no children of her own. So people like Ned can claim her as an aunt. And Lorenzo had a big posterity, but no children of her own. No children of her own. Never part of a traditional family situation. She was quite free in a lot of senses to carry out the mission that she wanted to carry out. And it becomes different if you have children and feel that responsibility. Mr. Pingree.
There's a story or a rumor about her experiences with Joseph Smith and Emma that essentially that Emma, well, I guess, became upset when she found out that Eliza was married and supposedly shoved her down the stairs. Do you want to comment about that?
That's the stairs question. Maureen Beecher wrote quite an article about this story. We have the evidence of very tender poems to Emma before and after Joseph's death, where she expresses her love, her sorrow, her support for Emma. We also know that at the time that Eliza moved out of the Smith house, Joseph's parents were moving in. They needed the room. There just isn't documentation for that story. It's quite widespread. There was bound to be some difficult feelings between the two of them.
Did she fall down the stairs?
We don't know that there were any stairs. We don't know that she came down any stairs.
Somebody missed the announcement.
Yeah, about stairs. You can ask any question that doesn't have the word stairs in it. No, that's fine. And people wonder about that. It's interesting how widely known that is.
Well, didn't Sam Taylor
Oh,
book and described it rather.
we just don't have any contemporaneous documentation for it. Yes?
Her authorship of Praise to the Man is brought up quite a bit too. What would you... like that story, it doesn't seem to be anything to it, but again, it's thrown around so often.
I think that case was open and it's now shut for the simple reason that in one of the primary hymn books that she edited, the credit is given to William W. Phelps. When it was first printed, it says, by Eliza R. Snow, here's another poem of hers, In Times and Seasons, and then Praise to the Man below that, and another author's name is not given. So people are very upset when she doesn't get credit. But besides that piece of evidence, which I think is pretty conclusive, that was her book that she was editing, and she gave him the credit. She didn't ever do what we call parody hymn writing. Parody doesn't necessarily, in this context, mean comical. It means you take an existing poem and you tinker with it, as William W. Phelps did often, like Joy to the World, the Mormon version of Joy to the World. He did that often. Praise to the Man is based on a poem by Sir Walter Scott called Hail to the Chief, who in triumph advances, honored and blessed be the evergreen pine. So he changed a few words. She didn't write those kinds of hymn texts. Anything else?
I understand she had a locket that was given to her by Joseph Smith that said something about Secretary of Heaven.
I don't know about a locket with an inscription. He gave her a beautiful watch, which is in the First Presidency's vault. There's a picture of it in the book. There may have been a locket as well.
I just heard that.
Well, this is when I wish Jill could be here, and I would say, we'll turn that question over to Jill. She very well may know. I don't know. Yes?
I've heard that she had the gift of healing and was known to give healing blessings.
The question is, she had the gift of healing and was known to give healing blessings. There is no question that she and her sister wives of Brigham Young, especially the ones who stayed in winter quarters for a short time, held blessing meetings and performed healings quite often. And here again, Jill would probably know more, but this went on all the time. Really common in the early church. The sisters gave blessings to one another, especially at times of childbirth. They would bless each other.
When they organized the Relief Society, did they organize it along priesthood lines with deaconesses and priestesses and that kind of thing?
Can you repeat the question?
Did they organize the Relief Society with deaconesses and priestesses? There's a lot of discussion about that, because that implies priesthood authority, almost. Not widely used titles, as far as I know. No, and certainly not under Brigham Young. Brigham Young was very grateful, I'm sure, to have the Relief Society reestablished, as far as these vast spiritual visions of what it could mean for the sisters. That was Joseph Smith.
Who gave her the titles, or how did they come about, Presidentess and Prophetess?
Presidentess and Prophetess. I don't know. Often, though, in that day and age, women had the title, the title of their husband. She would be Mrs. Mayor or something like that. The title of Zion's Poetess was probably bestowed by Emmeline B. Wells. She may not have been the first one to use it, but the first one in print.
I'm not sure how the others were, or
No.
when they were first used, or who.
No, but if she's president of the Relief Society and you don't want to make her sound like a man, in that day and age you would probably just say Presidentess.
But Prophetess.
Well, and Prophetess, there were John Tullidge and others who thought she just had the look of a prophet, a prophetic look about her. I don't think she ever pretended to prophetic authority, not that I know of. Yes?
So how long did you say she was married to Brigham Young?
Well, she was married to him in 1844, and he died in 1877.
Okay, I misunderstood. Did she get along with him well?
Sat at the right hand at the dinner table, always. They were wonderful co-workers in what needed to be done, and she was just ready to carry out assignments having to do with a retail store, a hospital, whatever he thought needed to be done. They got along very well. That was beneficial to both. And after she was baptized, she was 31 before she joined the church. Soon after her baptism, she decided that if she was going to be a saint, she needed to join the saints in Kirtland. She left her beautiful childhood home, where she was still living, went to live with the saints in Kirtland, stayed with the saints in all their fleeing and travels, did not have her own roof over her head again until she moved into the Lion House in 1856. That was a long time. But if you were a single woman, for all practical purposes she was, you didn't create your own household, you lived under somebody else's roof. But how difficult that must have been. But a lovely room in the Lion House, security, the opportunity to really be of service, great respect in that family and among the saints.
Are any of her items on display in the museum?
Are any of her items on display? The best place to see some needlework and a writing desk that Joseph Smith gave her and a pen he gave her is the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers Museum.
But the watch, you say, is in the vault?
It's in the vault of the First Presidency.
Why won't they?
I'd love to see that be displayed, and maybe it will be sometime. And my real dream is to think that the church will make a real estate offer that they can't refuse to the owners of her home in Mandaway, Ohio, and we'll have a visitor's site. We don't have, it's mostly oriented toward the men of the church, the prominent men of the church, all the church sites. But how wonderful that would be. It's only a few miles from Kirtland, and it's just a beautiful home. Anybody would love growing up in that
How
home.
far from Kirtland is it?
12 or 15 miles at the most. It's very close. And
Out by Overland?
no, I don't know which direction to tell you it is. The people are very courteous, and we make sure to send them copies of each book that comes out about Eliza R. Snow, and it would just be so wonderful to have a visitor center or an adjunct visitor center there near Kirtland, where she grew up. Born in Massachusetts, but as a tiny baby they moved there. Yes.
When she was alive, did she always go by the name Eliza R. Snow, or did she use her married name when she was married to Joseph or Brigham?
Most interesting question. Until she joined the church, she didn't use her own name at the bottom of her poems. She used only pseudonyms. Pocahontas, Angerona, Tullia, Cornelia, lots of different pseudonyms, but she signed her name only with a pseudonym. After she joined the church, she writes a poem about how a friend had counseled her not to hide behind a pseudonym. And that friend was probably Joseph Smith, and no pseudonym ever appeared in the hundreds of poems she wrote after she was baptized. If you're going to be bearing your testimony and telling about the saints and then concealing who you are, that isn't going to have much impact. That isn't going to work very, very well. Now, as far as when she got married, she continued to go by Eliza R. Snow. She continued, after she married Joseph Smith, she continued to go by Eliza R. Snow most of the time when she was married to Brigham Young. That's the way she signed things. That's the way she signed her poems. After Brigham Young died, this is when she and Zina would stand in front of a meeting holding hands and saying, tell them you saw two of Joseph Smith's wives together. And if you visit the Brigham Young grave down here on, it's First Avenue, isn't it? Whose grave is only a few yards from Brigham Young's, and what does that grave say? Eliza R. Snow Smith. Right there, right next to Brigham Young, and she's emphasizing her identity there on her grave marker. And she told a group of Relief Society sisters that, I love this, Joseph Smith is the choice of my life, and the crown of my heart. That was where her real love was. So she is Smith, and she's there next to Brigham Young. That is what she chose.
As his wife.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Anything else?
Did she predecease Brigham Young or follow him?
Follow him. Follow him. This is when she got a little bolder about talking about being married to Joseph Smith, and many of the older saints of the church treasured that link back to the prophet. If they remembered Joseph Smith, then here was someone who had loved him just as they had loved him, and they liked this link back to Joseph Smith and to the original Relief Society. And plural marriage was not part of what she had learned about before she was baptized. And she tells us in this short autobiography, at first this was repugnant to my feelings, but then I grew to love this principle, and she was a very strong defender of plural marriage, especially in the last decades of her life, and especially as the trouble was coming from the government about plural marriage, and a lot of trouble with the federal government. So she defended plural marriage and was very outspoken, and there's one quotation where she says, if Emma Smith is going to claim that her husband never practiced polygamy, she had better have waited until all his wives had passed away, because she just was not going to let that be said. She was not going to let that go on. Yes.
If she was still alive, do you think she would see herself today as a feminist, or do you think that she would have something to say to the feminists?
Really interesting question, because some people are disappointed that she wasn't a suffrage activist, that she was not a suffragist. But somebody pointed out, look, she joined an upstart church, supported a revolutionary marriage system. She was a patriot who was forced to leave her country and come out here. How many revolutions is one woman supposed to be responsible to support? And we could talk about this for quite a while. She says things like, I acknowledge that in other places in the world where men are not righteous, of course those women have to be contending for their rights. But it's different with us here. It's different with us here in Utah. If the men are operating under the inspiration of heaven, and she liked metaphors like inspiration flowing like pure waters down from the mountains, and if the men are operating under that inspiration, the women can operate under the direction of the men, and that everyone benefits, everything is fine. And so she never said women should not have the vote, but she says, she would say, we women in Utah know what the important rights are. I don't know today what she would say. I don't think she would be retrograde. I don't think she would be saying maybe women don't really need the vote or anything like that.
What was her relationship like with the children in the young home?
There are some very affectionate things written by some of her stepdaughters, nieces, whatever you want to call them, that they would go in and talk to her, and often she would correct them, something about their dress or their manner, but they loved their Aunt Eliza. And this was sort of the best of both worlds. She had these young people to counsel with and give advice to and talk to without ever the very demanding direct responsibility of being their mother. She was kind of a privileged character, I think, in the Lyon house, in the Smith, in the Young household. Oh, go.
Sorry.
I thought you were gesturing to somebody.
Oh, no. I'm just wondering, how did she support herself after Brigham's death?
How did she support herself after Brigham's death? here again, I'm sure Jill would know, but I assume that a certain stipend, a certain kind of support would still be extended to her because she was taking on these very, very heavy responsibilities. In terms of earning her own keep, she taught school. Mainly her own keep was as a seamstress. And she was very good at needlework. She didn't have pretensions of going out into the world as a career woman, ever. But she never wandered for anything after she'd established herself. Yes.
How long did she live in the Smith home then?
In the
mansion house.
I don't know. I don't know the dates of where she was for what period of time. She was really in quite a few different. I think Jill counted, and there were 12 different roofs over her head between 1834 and 1856, not counting when she was traveling. I just think that would have been very hard. Very hard. Okay, shall we wrap it up? Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks. I guess open.
Well, that was terrific. I learned a lot. Did everybody learn something new? Yeah, thank you so much. You often defer to Jill, but you've probably forgotten more than any of us knows about Eliza-The Snow. I just learned the other day that in the Ohio town is also pronounced Manaway. I thought it was really weird that Utah has a town Mantewa, right? Manaway. I thought, oh no, UA is UA. Sorry, Mantua. Yeah, but so that's where it came from. I guess was the Ohio town. So you can tell I'm not a northern Utah boy.